Shatter the setup. A presidential audition gone wrong. 6 hours before the storm hit, Gavin Newsom strode into the Senate hearing room like he owned it. His charcoal gray suit was impeccably tailored, $3,000 minimum, the kind that made other politicians' off-the-rack outfits look like warehouse bargains. His hair was camera-ready, that signature silver-touched sweep that had graced countless magazine covers. Trailing 3 steps behind were his entourage, 2 senior aides, a communications director, and a deputy chief of staff, all clutching tablets and backup materials they were certain wouldn't be needed. The room was packed. The Senate Budget Committee had titled the session State Fiscal Policies and Federal Impact, California as Case Study. But everyone knew the real agenda. This was Newsom's unofficial 2028 presidential campaign launch, a platform to showcase the California model, prove progressive governance worked, and position himself as the Democratic Party's future. The media setup was unusual. Twice as many cameras as a typical budget hearing. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and all the major networks had sent crews. Political reporters who usually skipped committee hearings jockeyed for seats in the press gallery. Newsom surveyed the scene with practiced calm. Democratic senators smiled warmly. Senator Warren gave a small wave. Senator Murphy nodded with genuine admiration. On the Republican side, the reception was cooler but not hostile. Most seemed resigned to watching Newsom deliver a polished performance they couldn't match. Senator Grassley, the ranking member, reviewed his notes without looking up. Senator Cornyn checked his phone. And at the far end of the dais sat Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, shuffling papers, his reading glasses perched on his nose, seemingly oblivious to the governor's entrance. His desk was cluttered with folders and an unusually thick stack that his aide had brought in earlier. Newsom's eyes passed over Kennedy briefly. He knew the type, the folksy country lawyer routine, the aw-shucks demeanor masking a sharp legal mind. Newsom had faced dozens like him. They asked gotcha questions. He delivered polished responses, and the news cycle moved on. Nothing to worry about. Kennedy glanced up, caught Newsom's eye, smiled warmly, and gave a small nod. Newsom nodded back, dismissing him mentally, just a country bumpkin playing senator. He had no idea what was coming. The opening act. A polished performance chairman, Sanders, called the hearing to order at 10:02 a.m. sharp. Today's hearing will examine state fiscal policies and their impact on federal programs and the national economy. We've invited Governor Gavin Newsom of California to share his state's experience with progressive economic policies. Governor Newsom, thank you for joining us. You may proceed with your opening statement. Newsom activated his microphone and smiled for the cameras. Thank you, Chairman Sanders, Ranking Member Grassley, and distinguished members of the committee. I'm honored to be here today to discuss California's approach to governance and economic development. He launched into his prepared remarks, and they were, by any objective measure, impressive. His delivery was TED Talk polished, conversational yet authoritative, peppered with statistics but never dry, passionate but controlled. California is the 5th largest economy in the world, he declared, leaning into the microphone. Not the 5th largest state economy. The 5th largest economy, period. Larger than the United Kingdom, larger than India. Our GDP exceeds 3.6 trillion. He clicked through invisible mental slides, hitting every talking point with precision. Climate leadership. California has reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 20% from 2006 levels, while growing our economy by 70%. We've committed to 100% clean electricity by 2045. We're proving that environmental responsibility and economic growth aren't mutually exclusive. social investment. We've expanded healthcare coverage to include all low-income residents regardless of immigration status. We've raised the minimum wage to $16 an hour, with further increases scheduled. We're investing in affordable housing, childcare, and education. Innovation. Silicon Valley continues to lead the world in technological innovation. California companies are at the forefront of artificial intelligence, clean energy, biotechnology, and the digital economy of the future. His conclusion was pitch perfect. California isn't just a state, it's a proof of concept. Proof that progressive values, investment in people, protection of the environment, belief in the common good, these aren't just idealistic aspirations, they're practical policies that produce results. He sat back, satisfied. Democratic senators nodded approvingly. Senator Warren was practically beaming. Even some Republicans looked grudgingly impressed by the performance, if not the content. In the press gallery, reporters were already drafting headlines. Newsom makes case for progressive governance. California governor delivers presidential-level performance. Kennedy was still shuffling papers, barely seeming to pay attention. The softballs. Building momentum. The softball questions came first, as expected. Senator Warren leaned into her microphone. Governor Newsom, California has been a leader on climate policy. Can you tell us more about how your state has balanced environmental protection with economic growth? Newsom's answer was expansive, detailed, and utterly rehearsed. He spoke for 4 minutes about electric vehicle mandates, solar installations, cap-and-trade programs. He mentioned Tesla, which was awkward, given that the company had left California, but he glossed over it smoothly. Senator Murphy followed up on healthcare expansion, another 4-minute answer, this time about Medi-Cal, the uninsured rate, and the moral imperative of universal coverage. Senator Whitehouse asked about technology and innovation. Newsom pivoted seamlessly into remarks about artificial intelligence, California's research universities, and the importance of federal investment in R&D. With each question, Newsom grew more confident. He started adding commentary the questions hadn't asked for. He interrupted senators to provide additional context. He glanced at the Republican side of the dais with something approaching pity. At one point, while discussing California's economy, he couldn't resist a jab. Of course, some states have chosen a different path: lower taxes, fewer regulations, less investment in public services, and we've seen the results: crumbling infrastructure, poor health outcomes, widening inequality. California has chosen to believe that government can be a force for good, and the results speak for themselves. Kennedy looked up briefly at this. He made a small note on his legal pad, then went back to his papers. Chairman Sanders worked through the Democratic questioners. Each exchange followed the same pattern: friendly question, polished answer, mutual congratulation. Newsom was enjoying himself now, visibly relaxed, treating the hearing less like testimony and more like a campaign event. After the Republican round, initial probes. When it came time for Republican questions, Senator Grassley led off with predictable queries about federal spending and state debt. Newsom handled them easily, citing statistics about California's balanced budget and rainy day fund. Senator Cornyn asked about immigration. Newsom delivered his standard response about welcoming newcomers and the economic contributions of immigrants, a bit testier, but nothing he couldn't handle. The clock ticked toward noon. Newsom's staff began to relax. The worst seemed to be over. Then Chairman Sanders looked at his list. "Senator Kennedy, you're recognized for 10 minutes. Kennedy activated his microphone slowly. He removed his reading glasses, cleaned them with his tie, and put them back on. When he spoke, his voice was warm, almost grandfatherly. "Governor Newsom, I appreciate you coming all this way, and I have to say, that was quite a presentation. Made me almost want to move to California. Newsom smiled graciously. We'd be happy to have you, Senator. Almost, Kennedy repeated, holding up a finger. Almost, but I've got a few questions, if you don't mind, just trying to understand some things. Of course, Senator, that's why I'm here. Good, good. Kennedy picked up a document from his stack. Now, you mentioned California is the fifth largest economy in the world. That's mighty impressive. And I noticed you had lots of statistics about GDP growth and climate emissions and such. Yes, Senator, the data supports, but I noticed you didn't mention population trends. Kennedy looked up, his expression one of innocent curiosity. How many people moved to California last year versus how many left? Newsom's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. Well, Senator, California continues to attract talent from around the world. We see significant international immigration. I asked about net migration, Governor. People coming versus people going. The Census Bureau tracks this. Do you know what their numbers show? There has been some domestic out-migration, primarily retirees seeking lower cost of living in other states. Mostly retirees? Kennedy repeated, nodding. I see. He made a note, didn't push further, moved on. You mentioned climate leadership. California's committed to 100% clean electricity by 2045. That's ambitious. But I'm curious, how much did Californians pay for electricity last year compared to, say, folks in Louisiana? Newsom shifted slightly. Energy costs reflect our investment in clean technology. Was it more or less than Louisiana? California's rates are higher, but when you factor in the health costs of pollution, just the electricity bills, Governor, higher or lower? Higher. How much higher? Newsom's staff stirred behind him. The communications director was typing furiously on her tablet. I don't have the exact figures in front of me. I do, Kennedy said mildly. He pulled out a sheet. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the average retail price of electricity in California was 22.4 cents per kilowatt hour in 2023. In Louisiana, it was 11.2 cents. That means Californians pay exactly double what folks in my state pay for electricity. Double. Senator, you can't put a price on clean air. I'm not asking about clean air. I'm asking about electricity bills, and California's are double ours. Kennedy made another note. Interesting. He asked a few more questions about tech companies, the film industry, agriculture. Newsom handled them reasonably well, regaining some composure. Kennedy nodded along, made notes, seemed satisfied with the answers. The 10 minutes were almost up. Newsom's staff began to relax again. Kennedy gathered his papers as if preparing to yield back. Then he paused. Governor, just to make sure I have this right, because I want to be fair to you, California's economy is thriving, your policies are working, and the people who leave are mostly retirees looking for warmer weather and lower costs. Is that a fair summary of your testimony? Newsom nodded confidently. That's correct, Senator. California remains the place where people want to be. Good, Kennedy smiled. I just wanted to make sure I understood your position. He picked up a thick folder. Because I have some questions about that. The turning point. Population exodus exposed. Kennedy opened the folder methodically, as if he had all the time in the world. Governor, I've got some data here from the U.S. Census Bureau. Not a right-wing think tank, not Fox News. The United States Census Bureau, a federal agency that's been counting Americans since 1790. He pulled out a chart. According to their numbers, between 2010 and 2020, California had a net domestic out-migration of approximately 1.2 million people. He let that number hang in the air. 1.2 million. That's not a rounding error, Governor. That's the entire population of Dallas, Texas, just up and leaving your state in 3 years. Newsom leaned forward. Senator, those numbers require context. I'm giving you context, Kennedy said, his voice still friendly but with a new edge. The context is this. California lost more residents to domestic migration than any other state in America during that period. More than New York, more than Illinois. Nobody's even close. Newsom tried to interrupt. International immigration offsets. Oh, I'm glad you mentioned that. Kennedy pulled out another sheet. Yes, California does receive international immigrants, but you know who those immigrants are, Governor. Many of them are people whose visas are sponsored by companies headquartered in California. They don't have a choice about where to go. Their employer tells them to go to California, so they go. He looked up. You're not attracting people, Governor. You're retaining captive employees, while everyone who has a choice is running for the exits. The room had grown very quiet now. Now, you said these were mostly retirees, but the census data breaks down who's leaving. And it turns out, Governor, it's not mostly retirees. It's working-age adults, families, people aged 25 to 54, the prime earning years, the people who pay taxes, start businesses, create jobs. Those are the people leaving California. Newsom attempted to respond. The pandemic. You also mentioned in your opening statement that California's economy is thriving, 5th largest in the world. And that's true in a sense. But let's talk about what that economy looks like. Kennedy pulled out a list. I want to read some names, Governor. These are companies that have moved their headquarters out of California in recent years. Tesla moved to Texas. Oracle, Texas. Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, Texas. Charles Schwab, Texas. CBRE Group, Texas. Palantir, Colorado. Jamba Juice, Texas. Jacobs Engineering, Texas. McKesson, Texas. He looked up. Do you notice a pattern, Governor? These aren't shoe stores. These are Fortune 500 companies, some of the most valuable businesses in America. And they all decided that California wasn't worth it anymore. Newsom's jaw tightened. Headquarters relocations are primarily symbolic. Symbolic? Kennedy's eyebrows rose. Governor, when Tesla moves its headquarters, it takes jobs. When Oracle moves, it takes billions of dollars in economic activity. When all these companies move, they take their corporate taxes, their employee income taxes, their property taxes, their vendor contracts. He spread the papers across his desk. According to the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, that's in California, Governor, not Texas, California lost over 350 company headquarters between 2018 and 2023. 350 businesses looked at your state and said, "No, thank you." Kennedy leaned back in his chair. You came here to tell us California is a model, but the people who actually live there, the businesses who actually operate there, they're voting with their feet. They're voting with their moving trucks. They're voting with their corporate relocations. He paused. And every single one of them is saying the same thing. California isn't working. Newsom opened his mouth to respond, but Kennedy wasn't finished. So I'll ask you a simple question, Governor. If California's policies are so successful, why is everyone leaving? For the first time, Newsom had no smooth answer ready. Kennedy let the silence linger for a moment, then shifted topics with the ease of a man changing channels on a television. The homeless crisis, $20 billion down the drain. Let's talk about something else. You mentioned in your opening statement, Governor, social investment, helping the most vulnerable. You said California leads the nation in social services. Do you remember saying that? Newsom nodded cautiously. California has made unprecedented investments in our social safety net. Yes, you have. And one thing California certainly leads the nation in is homelessness. Is that fair to say? Homelessness is a complex, multifaceted issue affecting cities across America. Governor, I didn't ask if it was complex. I asked if California leads the nation in homelessness. Does it? We have a significant homeless population, yes, but according to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, that's HUD, Governor, a federal agency, California has approximately 180,000 homeless individuals. That's about 28% of all homeless people in America, in one state that contains about 12% of America's population. Kennedy removed his glasses and looked directly at Newsom. So you've got 12% of the population and 28% of the homeless. That's more than double your share. Is that correct? Newsom's voice had grown tighter. The numbers reflect decades of underinvestment in affordable housing. Is that number correct, Governor? 180,000 homeless? The numbers are approximately correct. Thank you. Kennedy put his glasses back on and pulled out a thick document. Now, here's what I find fascinating. Because California hasn't ignored this problem. Not at all. In fact, since 2019, California has spent approximately $20 billion on homelessness programs. $20 billion with a B. He let that sink in. Governor, can you help me understand what $20 billion looks like? Because that's a hard number to visualize. Didn't wait for an answer. $20 billion divided by 180,000 homeless individuals equals approximately $111,000 per person. If you just took that money and handed each homeless person a check, they could buy a house, a modest house maybe, but an actual house with a roof and walls and a door that locks. Kennedy spread out more documents. But you didn't do that. You spent it on programs, homeless services, administrative costs, consultants, studies. So let me ask you, after spending $20 billion, by how much has the homeless population decreased? Newsom shifted in his seat. These programs take time to show results. How much has it decreased, Governor? There are metrics that show progress in certain areas. Governor, I'm asking a simple question. You spent $20 billion. Did the number of homeless people go up or did it go down? A long pause. The numbers have fluctuated. Kennedy nodded slowly. Fluctuated. That's an interesting word. Let me tell you what the actual numbers show. According to California's own data, your own state government's reports, the homeless population has increased by approximately 30% since you took office. He leaned forward. You spent $20 billion and the problem got 30% worse. Does that sound like a successful program to you? Newsom attempted to respond. The pandemic created unprecedented challenges. The pandemic, Governor? Other states had pandemics too. Texas had a pandemic. Florida had a pandemic. Their homeless populations didn't increase by 30%. Kennedy pulled out more documents and spread them across his desk. So I started asking myself, where did $20 billion actually go? And the answers are illuminating. He read from the papers. Item 1. Administrative overhead. According to a state audit, some homeless programs spent over 40% of their budgets on administration. 40 cents of every dollar went to salaries, offices, paperwork, not to actually helping homeless people. Item 2. Consultants and studies. California spent hundreds of millions of dollars on consultants to study homelessness, to write reports about homelessness, to develop strategies for addressing homelessness. Meanwhile, the homeless population kept growing. Item 3. Real estate purchases. The state bought properties for homeless housing at prices that would make a Manhattan real estate developer blush. I found one project that spent $600,000 per unit. $600,000 for a single apartment. In some neighborhoods, you could buy a 3-bedroom house for that. Item 4. Programs with no measurable outcomes. Hundreds of millions of dollars went to service providers who couldn't demonstrate any results. No tracking of how many people they helped, no measurement of success. Just money going out the door. Kennedy gathered the papers into a neat stack. Governor, I'm not an accountant, but I can add. And what I see is $20 billion spent with almost nothing to show for it. Either the money was wasted through incompetence, or it was stolen through corruption, or some combination of both. He looked directly at Newsom. So I'm going to ask you one more time, and I'd appreciate a straight answer. Where exactly did $20 billion go? The silence stretched. Newsom's communications director was furiously typing. His chief of staff had his head in his hands. Newsom finally spoke, his voice strained. Senator, homelessness is the result of complex systemic factors, including housing costs, mental health, substance abuse. Governor, I didn't ask you why people are homeless. I asked you where the money went, $20 billion of California taxpayers' money. Can you tell me specifically where it went and what results it achieved? We have invested in a range of programs and services. Can you tell me how many people those programs helped get off the streets and stay off the streets? We're developing metrics to track. Governor, after spending $20 billion, you're still developing metrics? You don't know if your programs work? Kennedy shook his head slowly. You came here to tell us California is a model, but the model seems to be spend vast amounts of money, achieve no results, blame complex systemic factors. Repeat. He made a note on his legal pad. That's not a model, Governor, that's a racket. Chairman Sanders looked at the clock. Senator Kennedy, your time has... Mr. Chairman, I'd like to request additional time if my colleagues will indulge me. I have several more areas to cover. Senator Grassley nodded. I'll yield the ranking member's time to Senator Kennedy. Sanders looked uncomfortable but couldn't object. Senator Kennedy, you're recognized for an additional 10 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The boondoggle, high-speed rail to nowhere. Kennedy pulled out a new folder. His voice was almost cheerful. Governor, let's take a trip down memory lane. Back to 2008. You were Lieutenant Governor then, if I recall. California voters approved Proposition 1A, the high-speed rail bond measure. You supported it. Can you tell me what that proposition promised? Newsom nodded wearily. I remember the initiative. Let me refresh everyone's memory. Kennedy pulled out faded campaign materials. Proposition 1A promised high-speed rail connecting Los Angeles and San Francisco. Travel time, 2 hours and 40 minutes. Completion date, 2020. Total cost, $33 billion, funded by a mix of federal grants, state bonds, and private investment. He set down the paper. That was the promise. California voters approved a bullet train connecting your 2 largest cities in under 3 hours. Fast, modern, efficient, the kind of thing they have in Japan and France and China. Kennedy looked up. So here we are, Governor, 17 years later. How many miles of high-speed rail track are currently operational? Newsom straightened his tie. The project has faced significant challenges. How many miles are operational, Governor? Construction is actively underway in the Central Valley. How many miles, Governor? It's a simple question. If I wanted to ride California's high-speed rail today, how many miles could I travel? A long pause. 0. Kennedy nodded. 0. 17 years and 0 miles of operational high-speed rail. He pulled out another document. Now, let's talk about cost. The original estimate was $33 billion. What's the current estimate to complete the full system? Newsom sighed. Cost estimates have been revised due to what's the current estimate? Approximately $128 billion for the full Los Angeles to San Francisco system. Kennedy let out a low whistle. $128 billion. Let me do the math here. That's roughly 4 times the original estimate. The project is 17 years behind schedule, percent complete, and 4 times over budget. He shook his head in wonder. And here's the best part, Governor. The section currently under construction, the only section with any active work. It doesn't connect Los Angeles and San Francisco. Do you know what cities it connects? Newsom said nothing. Merced to Bakersfield, Kennedy answered himself. Now, I don't mean any disrespect to Merced or Bakersfield, fine communities, I'm sure, but Governor, can you tell me with a straight face how many people are desperately waiting for high-speed rail between Merced and Bakersfield? A few people in the gallery laughed. Kennedy didn't smile. This isn't funny, though, because California voters were promised something real. They approved real money, $9.5 billion in bonds that California taxpayers are still paying interest on. And what they got in return is 17 years of studies, environmental reviews, lawsuits, delays, and a construction project that connects 2 cities that nobody particularly needs to travel between. Kennedy pulled out one more document. You know what's happening in Texas right now, Governor? A private company, no government money, no taxpayer bonds, is building high-speed rail between Houston and Dallas. Expected completion, 2026. Total cost, about $30 billion. That's less than a quarter of your estimate. And they're actually going to finish it, with private money. He spread his hands. So let me ask you, why can a private company in Texas build a high-speed rail system faster and cheaper than California can, with unlimited taxpayer money? What does that tell us about the California model? Newsom attempted a response. The Texas project has faced its own challenges. Has it spent $128 billion with 0 miles to show for it? No. But then, whatever challenges they've faced, they're ahead of you. Way ahead. Kennedy gathered his high-speed rail documents and set them aside. Governor, you came here to tell us California is a model of progressive governance, but your signature infrastructure project, the one that was supposed to prove government can build big things, is a 17-year, $128 billion hole in the ground connecting nowhere to nowhere. He looked directly at Newsom. Is this the model you want other states to follow? The hypocrisy. Rules for thee, not for me. Kennedy paused to take a sip of water. When he resumed, his tone had shifted, less folksy, more serious. Governor, I want to talk about November 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic was raging. California was under strict lockdown orders. Orders you signed. Do you remember what those orders prohibited? Newsom's posture stiffened. He knew where this was going. The orders were based on CDC guidance and public health recommendations. What did they prohibit, Governor? Let's be specific. Kennedy pulled out a printed copy of California's November 2020 COVID restrictions. No indoor dining at restaurants. No gatherings of more than 3 households. Wear masks at all times when outside your home. Avoid non-essential travel. And this is important. The Thanksgiving guidance specifically told Californians not to gather with people outside their immediate household. He looked up. Governor, you went on television. You looked into the camera and told California families they couldn't have Thanksgiving together. You told grandparents they couldn't see their grandchildren. You told parents their kids couldn't come home from college for the holiday. This is about saving lives, you said. Do you remember that? Newsom's jaw was tight. I was following public health guidance. Do you remember where you were on November 6th, 2020? Silence. Kennedy pulled out an enlarged photograph. This is the French Laundry restaurant in Napa Valley. 3 Michelin stars. One of the finest restaurants in America, about $350 per person for dinner. And this photograph, published by local news media, shows you there on November 6th, 2020, just days before you told Californians they couldn't gather for Thanksgiving. He held up the photo for everyone to see. Let me describe what we're looking at. A large group gathered around a table. I count at least 12 people. No masks visible. Indoor dining at a time when your own executive order prohibited indoor dining. Multiple households gathered together when your own order prohibited gatherings of more than 3 households. Kennedy set down the photo. Governor, by your own executive order, this gathering was illegal. Every single restriction you told Californians to follow, no indoor dining, no large gatherings, masks required, you violated every single one of them in one dinner. Newsom leaned into his microphone. I've acknowledged that was a mistake. A mistake? Kennedy's voice sharpened. Governor, while you were eating $350 dinners with lobbyists, small business owners across California were watching their restaurants die. They were laying off employees. They were defaulting on their leases. They were losing businesses their families had built over generations. He leaned forward. And it wasn't just restaurants. Families were being told they couldn't gather for Thanksgiving. Church congregations couldn't worship together. Funerals were limited to 10 people to people. People were dying alone in hospitals because their families couldn't visit. Kennedy's voice dropped lower. And you were at the French Laundry, eating, tasting menus with lobbyists. He pulled out another document. Let's talk about who else was at that dinner, Governor. The person whose birthday you were celebrating. That was Jason Kinney, correct? A lobbyist, a political consultant who has made millions from clients who do business with the state of California. Newsom didn't respond. And also at that dinner were executives from the California Medical Association, the same organization that was publicly supporting your lockdown policies. The same doctors who were going on television telling ordinary Californians to stay home were at this dinner with you, breaking every rule you had imposed. Kennedy shook his head slowly. Governor, you know what we call that in Louisiana? We call it rules for thee, but not for me. The people who make the rules don't think the rules apply to them. He paused. And you know what else we call people who make rules they don't follow themselves? We have a word for that. It starts with H. Do you want me to say it, Governor? Or would you like to? I've apologized for that dinner. You apologized because you got caught. Someone at the restaurant leaked that photo, and suddenly you had to apologize. But if that photo hadn't leaked, Governor, if no one had taken a picture, would you have apologized? Would you have even mentioned it? Silence. The answer is no. You would have kept telling Californians to sacrifice, to stay home, to miss their holidays, while you lived by different rules, because the rules, in your mind, aren't for people like you. They're for the little people, the ordinary Californians who don't have lobbyist friends with access to $350 dinners. Kennedy gathered the French Laundry documents. You talk about progressive values, Governor, about caring for the vulnerable, about shared sacrifice. But when it was your turn to sacrifice, when it was your turn to miss a fancy dinner, to follow your own rules, you couldn't do it. You wouldn't do it. He looked directly at Newsom. That tells me everything I need to know about your values and the crime wave, Proposition 47's legacy. Kennedy consulted his notes and turned to yet another folder. Governor, let's talk about public safety. In 2014, California passed Proposition 47. You supported it. Can you tell me what that proposition did? Newsom cleared his throat. It reclassified certain nonviolent offenses to reduce mass incarceration. It raised the threshold for felony theft from $450 to $950. Any theft under $950 became a misdemeanor. Essentially, you told criminals, steal up to $949 and it's just a ticket. Is that an accurate description? That's an oversimplification. Is the $950 threshold accurate? Yes, but the intent was to reduce prison overcrowding. Thank you. Kennedy pulled out a stack of papers. Since Proposition 47 passed, organized retail theft in California has exploded. And I'm not using that word loosely. I mean exploded. He began reading from news articles. Target closed 9 stores in California, citing organized retail crime. Walgreens closed multiple San Francisco locations for the same reason. Nordstrom Rack, CVS, Old Navy, Whole Foods, all reducing their California presence because of theft. He looked up. And it's not just statistics. There are videos, Governor. Hundreds of them. Videos that went viral across the country, showing people walking into California stores, filling garbage bags with merchandise, and walking out. Security guards standing there doing nothing because they've been told not to intervene. Police not responding because what's the point when it's just a misdemeanor? Kennedy described the scenes without showing them. Flash mobs of thieves hitting luxury stores, smash and grab robberies in broad daylight, cars backing up to store entrances to load stolen goods, and, in every single video, the same thing. Nobody stops them, because in California, stealing $949 worth of merchandise is basically a parking ticket. He sat down the papers. Governor, when the whole country watched those videos, what do you think they saw? They saw lawlessness. They saw a state that had given up on enforcing basic property rights. They saw your California model in action. Newsom attempted a response. Crime is a complex issue, and these incidents, while troubling, don't represent what? California has the highest rate of property crime in the nation, according to FBI statistics, not right-wing media. Is that not representative? Many of those statistics reflect reporting differences. Governor, I've heard that excuse from every politician whose city or state has a crime problem. The statistics don't tell the whole story. But you know what does tell a story? Target closing 9 stores. Walgreens leaving San Francisco. Businesses putting products behind locked plexiglass so customers need an employee to buy toothpaste. Kennedy leaned forward. Let me tell you who really suffers from this, Governor. It's not the big corporations. Target has insurance. Walgreens will survive. When they close stores, they just write it off and move on. The people who suffer are the small business owners, the mom and pop shops that can't afford to lose inventory to theft. The Korean grocer who saves for 20 years to open a store and watches teenagers walk in and clean out the shelves. The family pharmacy that can't afford security guards and plexiglass. And it's the people who live in those neighborhoods. When Walgreens closes, where do elderly people get their prescriptions? When grocery stores leave, where do families buy food? Your policies don't hurt rich people, Governor. Rich people drive to another store. Your policies devastate poor communities. Kennedy pulled out one more document. Let's talk about San Francisco specifically, the city you used to run as mayor. Open-air drug markets operating without interference. Fentanyl overdose deaths up 400% since 2019. Human feces on sidewalks so common that there's literally an app, I'm not making this up, an app that San Franciscans can use to report and track feces on public streets. He shook his head. Governor, I've been to San Francisco. It's one of the most beautiful cities in America. The bay, the bridges, the hills. And you have turned it into a place where people step over needles and human waste on their way to work, where tourists are warned not to leave anything visible in their cars, where residents have just given up. Kennedy gathered all his papers. You came here to tell us California is a model. But what I see is a state where criminals steal with impunity, where drug addicts die on the streets, where businesses flee and families lock their doors. That's not a model, Governor. That's a cautionary tale. That's what happens when ideology trumps common sense, when appearing compassionate matters more than actually helping people. He looked at the clock. That's what you want to export to the rest of America. And I think, after today, most Americans will say, no thank you. Chairman Sanders shifted uncomfortably. Senator Kennedy, I believe your time has... Mr. Chairman, with your indulgence, I have just a few more questions and then I'll wrap up. I promise. Sanders looked at the other members. No one objected. Thank you. The final blow. A presidential dream shattered. Kennedy set aside his folders. When he spoke again, his voice was different, quieter, more serious. Governor Newsom, I want to thank you for coming here today. I mean that sincerely, because the American people needed to see this. He paused, letting the words settle. You walked into this room 6 hours ago with your perfectly tailored suit and your poll-tested talking points. You were ready to tell us that California is the future, that progressive policies work, that you, Gavin Newsom, should be trusted with even more power, maybe the highest power in the land. Kennedy gestured to the documents spread across his desk. But here's what the American people actually saw today. And they saw a governor whose citizens are fleeing in record numbers, 1.2 million people in 3 years, voting with their feet, saying California isn't worth it anymore. They saw a state that spent $20 billion on homelessness and has nothing to show for it except more homeless people. They saw a $128 billion train project that, after 17 years, connects nowhere to nowhere. They saw a leader who locked down his state, told families they couldn't have Thanksgiving together, and then went to a $350 a plate dinner with lobbyists. They saw policies that have turned San Francisco from one of America's most beautiful cities into an open-air drug market. And they saw you sit there, hour after hour, and tell us, this is a model. This is what you want to do to the whole country. Kennedy leaned forward. Governor, I know you're thinking about 2028. Everybody knows. You've been running for president since the day you took office. Every policy, every speech, every photo opportunity. It's all about positioning yourself for the White House. So let me give you some free advice from a simple country senator who's been around politics for a while. His voice hardened. The American people aren't stupid. They can see through the hair gel and the smooth talk. They watch the news. They see the videos. They talk to the people moving to their states from California. They know what's happening. And when they see someone whose state is failing, whose policies have demonstrably made things worse, standing up and saying, this is the future, they know what they're looking at. They're looking at someone who's either delusional or dishonest. Kennedy paused. And I don't think you're delusional, Governor. He stood up from his seat, gathering his materials. You came here to audition for president, but what you showed us today is exactly why you should never be president. Because you're not interested in solving problems. You're interested in talking about solving problems while the problems get worse. You're not interested in serving the people. You're interested in the appearance of service. The photo ops, the press conferences, the applause lines, while real people suffer the consequences of your failures. You had every advantage, Governor. California should be paradise, perfect weather, incredible natural resources, world-class universities, the most innovative companies on Earth. And you have turned it into a place people are desperate to leave. Kennedy picked up his folders and tapped them into a neat stack. California used to be the Golden State, the place everyone wanted to go. The American dream made real. And in just a few years, you and politicians like you have turned it into a warning, a cautionary tale, a case study in how progressive ideology can destroy even the most blessed and beautiful places. He looked directly at Newsom. Oh, some people did something to California, Governor, and those people are you. The politicians who valued appearing virtuous over being effective, who cared more about the applause of their ideological allies than the welfare of their citizens, who spent billions of dollars on programs that don't work and called it compassion. Kennedy turned toward the door, then stopped. The American people are watching, Governor. They've been watching this whole hearing, and they're not going to forget what they saw today. They're going to remember that when you had a chance to explain yourself, to account for your failures, to show some humility, you couldn't do it. You just kept insisting that everything was fine while the evidence piled up around you. He shook his head slowly. That's not leadership, Governor. That's denial. And America can't afford a president who's in denial about the consequences of his own policies. Kennedy looked at Chairman Sanders. I yield back. The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Photographers' cameras clicked in rapid succession. Democratic senators huddled in urgent conversation. Republican senators sat back with expressions ranging from satisfaction to shock at what they'd just witnessed. At the witness table, Gavin Newsom sat frozen. His communications director was whispering urgently in his ear, but he didn't seem to hear her. His chief of staff was already on the phone. Damage control mode activated. Chairman Sanders banged his gavel repeatedly. This hearing is in recess. This hearing is in recess. Newsom finally stood, his movements mechanical, his famous poise completely shattered. He gathered his papers, though there was nothing in them that could help him now, and walked toward the exit. Reporters surged forward. Governor, do you have a response to Senator Kennedy's questions? Governor, what about the 20 belulas? Rebellion. Governor, are you still planning to run in 2028? Newsom's security team formed a wedge, pushing through the crowd. He didn't answer any questions. He didn't make eye contact with anyone. He just walked, as quickly as dignity would allow, toward the door. As he passed Kennedy's seat, the senator was calmly organizing his folders, chatting with an aide about something that appeared to be completely unrelated. Kennedy glanced up as Newsom passed. Their eyes met for just a moment. Kennedy gave him that same warm, folksy smile he'd offered at the start of the hearing. Safe travels back to California, Governor. Newsom didn't respond. He walked out of the hearing room and didn't look back. Aftermath. The viral reckoning. The C-SPAN video of the hearing hit 45 million views within 24 hours. By the end of the week, it had been viewed over 100 million times across all platforms: YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok. Clips were everywhere. Kennedy destroys Newsom became a top search term. The full 6-hour hearing was uploaded, downloaded, re-uploaded, and analyzed frame by political commentators across the spectrum. Mainstream media tried to frame it as a Republican attack. GOP senator launches partisan assault on California governor. Kennedy's questioning criticized as political theater. But the framing didn't stick. The clips were too damaging, the facts too clear. People could watch for themselves and make their own judgments. Democratic response was notably muted. Nancy Pelosi released a statement calling the hearing a partisan exercise, but didn't specifically defend Newsom's record. Chuck Schumer declined to comment. The potential 2028 rivals, Gretchen Whitmer, Pritzker, Josh Shapiro, issued no statements at all, a silence that spoke volumes. Within the Democratic Party, the quiet conversations were less charitable. He walked right into it. One Senate aide told Politico anonymously he thought he was going to give a campaign speech, and Kennedy ate him alive. Another Democratic strategist was blunter. Gavin's always been good at talking. Turns out he's not so good when someone talks back. The California media was split. The San Francisco Chronicle published a defensive editorial arguing that Kennedy had cherry-picked statistics and ignored California's genuine accomplishments. The piece was ratioed into oblivion on social media, with commenters posting links to the actual data. The Sacramento Bee took a different approach, publishing an investigative piece titled "Questions Newsom Must Answer," and notably, Newsom's office declined to provide answers. The Los Angeles Times, after a week of internal debate, published an editorial calling for greater transparency in homeless spending and a reassessment of the high-speed rail project. For California's paper of record, it was practically a declaration of war. National polling showed the damage. Newsom's favorability rating dropped 14 points in 2 weeks. Among independents, the drop was 21 points. In 2028 primary polling, he fell from first place to fourth, behind Whitmer, Shapiro, and even Pete Buttigieg. The question, "Would you vote for Gavin Newsom for president?" showed 62% saying no. But the most devastating polls were from California itself. For the first time in his governorship, Newsom's approval rating in his own state dropped below 50%. A recall effort that had been moribund suddenly found new life, gathering signatures at 3 times the previous rate. Republican challengers who had been written off began raising serious money. 3 weeks after the hearing, Newsom held a press conference in Sacramento. It was supposed to be about wildfire preparedness, but everyone knew the real topic. He looked tired. The famous Newsom Polish was still there, but dimmer somehow. The suit was perfect. The hair was perfect, but the confidence that had always animated him seemed forced. "I want to address the recent Senate hearing," he said, reading from prepared remarks. Senator Kennedy engaged in a partisan attack designed to distort California's record and undermine confidence in progressive governance. His questions were misleading, his statistics were cherry-picked, and his conclusions were predetermined. He looked up from the paper. "But I also want to acknowledge that we have work to do. California faces real challenges. Homelessness, housing costs, crime. These are issues that affect real people, and we need to do better. I'm committed to improving outcomes for all Californians." The press wasn't satisfied. "Governor, Senator Kennedy asked where $20 billion in homeless spending went. Can you answer that question now? We've invested in a comprehensive approach to homelessness that includes, Governor, can you account for the spending specifically? Can you tell us what outcomes were achieved? We are implementing new metrics and accountability measures. Governor, are you still planning to run for president in 2028? Newsom paused. This was the question everyone was waiting for. "I'm focused on serving the people of California," he said finally. "That's my job. That's my commitment. Any decisions about the future will be made at the appropriate time." It wasn't a no, but it wasn't the confident yes that everyone had expected a month earlier. The press conference ended without any real answers. Epilogue, a cautionary tale. The consequences continued to unfold over the following months. The California State Auditor announced a comprehensive review of homeless program spending. The preliminary findings, leaked to the press, were damning. Hundreds of millions of dollars with no documented outcomes, contracts awarded without competitive bidding, administrative costs far exceeding industry standards. The High-Speed Rail Authority quietly released a revised timeline, pushing the Merced to Bakersfield segment completion to 2030 at the earliest. The full Los Angeles to San Francisco system was moved to long-term planning phase, which everyone understood to mean never. Proposition 47 reform appeared on the next ballot. Voters approved it by 18 points, raising the felony threshold back to $400 and adding new penalties for repeat offenders. Newsom, reading the political winds, declined to campaign against it. In San Francisco, a new mayor was elected on a platform of public safety and common sense. Within a year, the open-air drug markets had been dispersed, the feces tracking app was no longer necessary, and tourists were returning to Union Square. The exodus from California continued, but the composition changed. Polls showed that the people leaving were increasingly citing governance and policy as their reasons, not just cost of living. They weren't just fleeing high prices, they were fleeing what California had become. And in the 2028 presidential race, the name Gavin Newsom was conspicuously absent. He announced in January 2027 that he would not seek the presidency, citing a desire to focus on completing the work in California and spend more time with family. The statement was gracious and dignified, and fooled no one. Kennedy killed his campaign before it started, one Democratic operative told The Atlantic. That hearing was supposed to be Newsom's coming-out party. Instead, it was his funeral. Years later, political scientists would study the Kennedy-Newsom hearing as a case study in accountability, how one afternoon of tough questions could change the trajectory of a political career and maybe even a state. The lesson, they concluded, wasn't complicated. Facts matter. Questions matter. Holding powerful people accountable matters. And sometimes, when someone stands up and simply asks, "Did this work? Where did the money go? Why should we trust you?" Sometimes that's enough. Some people did something to California, and for too long, nobody asked them to explain themselves. That hearing was just asking questions. It turns out, when you ask the right questions, the truth has a way of coming out. The truth set a lot of people free that day. Free from the illusion that California was working. Free from the idea that Gavin Newsom had all the answers. Free to see reality as it actually is, not as politicians want us to see it. That's all Kennedy did. He just asked questions. The truth did the rest. In California, the work of rebuilding continued. The homeless crisis didn't disappear overnight, but the new accountability measures meant that money was finally being tracked. Outcomes were finally being measured, and programs that didn't work were finally being ended. The homeless population stabilized, then began to decline, slowly but genuinely. The high-speed rail project was officially paused in 2029. The billions already spent were written off as a loss, a monument to hubris and poor planning. Private companies, learning from Texas's success, began exploring genuine high-speed rail options for California, but this time without taxpayer money at risk. Crime remained a challenge, but the Proposition 47 reforms made a difference. Retail theft declined. Stores that had closed began to reopen. The San Francisco doom loop reversed slowly as businesses gained confidence that the laws would be enforced. The Golden State, it turned out, wasn't beyond saving. It just needed leaders who cared more about results than rhetoric.